Good afternoon. Well, it's not afternoon. Sorry. Good morning. Hi, everybody. Rise and shine. Hope you're doing really good. We are just going to get our meeting going in about like 5 or 6 minutes. So for the time being, just chill and I hope you're comfortable and you're having a good week. Hey guys, welcome back. Another 3 minutes or so. Hey Eva, good morning. Hope you're doing good. Just another minute. Hey, look who's here. Peachy. Oh my goodness, are you going to be fighting an alligator again? Good morning, Kelly. Trying to read, Peach? Very smart. Okay, guys. Well, I mean, it's more or less 9 a.m., so I'm going to get it started. By the way, thanks, guys, for being back here. For the moment, it seems like we have a little bit of a smaller group, but the numbers will be whatever they are. And to all watching now, or at some time in the future, or maybe in the past, appreciate you guys. Okay, so today what we have is just one last little look at the material on the metaphysics of time. We were just going to wrap up the last author on this topic. So we started to discuss him previously on Wednesday, and we are going to just try to get through the last stuff today by David Lewis, classic 1971 paper, The Paradoxes of Time Travel. Okay, The Paradoxes of Time Travel by David Lewis from 1971. I think I mentioned to you guys last time that the position of the author of the paper, the thesis that he's defending, is just that time travel is logically possible. It's something that is not inconceivable. It's not something that is a logical contradiction. And that means that he has to try and contend with arguments that, no, it is impossible, because when you think through time travel scenarios, we're led into contradictions that are just absurd paradoxes. So he's trying to grapple with these stated paradoxes of time travel, and he tries to just defend the thesis that they do not actually show that it's impossible. Maybe that it's a little strange or weird, but not that it's something that could not happen. It doesn't embody any logical contradiction. Okay, so the first apparent paradox of time travel that we were starting with was, how can the same two events be separated by two unequal amounts of time? Okay. So okay, so this seems to be like an impossible situation for event A and event B to be separated by two different amounts of time. But that's exactly what is provided for by a time travel scenario. The definition of time travel that David Lewis gives is it's a discrepancy between two different measurements of time, or two different frames of time. So to illustrate that, I showed you guys like a little picture. Imagine we have a person here, it's 12 p.m., it's 12 noon, according to their wristwatch. They enter into this thing. Now they're in there. Say that they stay in there for what on their watch is shown as a 1 hour span. But then when they get out, there's a discrepancy, because their watch says 1 p.m. But all the other watches and external measurement devices in the world show that it's 6 p.m. So, like, what's the true answer as to how much time is in between him getting in and then getting out of the machine? Is it a 1 hour span of time, because that's how long it appears to be to him and to his watch? Or is it a 6 hour amount of time, because to anybody that's not entering and exiting the machine, they would see him enter at 12 and they would see him exit at 6. So to them, they would say it's 6 hours, but to him, it looks like it's 1. Can this be possible? Well, he says there's a way of eliminating this apparent paradox. And the way to do that is to distinguish two different types of time. Okay, so 1 second. I'm going to close a window in the other room because we have some leaf blowers and some garden work out there. Okay, yeah, sorry, thanks. Okay, well, anyway, I was saying, there are two different types of time then that are mentioned to explain away the appearance of this paradox. So first of all, personal time, then external time. And I believe I created notes on this last time, so maybe you can just remind us, anybody here in the meeting, what is the definition of personal time? Or if you don't have to give the verbatim definition, but if you do have like just any kind of memory of that, what's the overall idea? Personal time is time as it's experienced or as it is measured by who or what? Question for you. Let's see. Time that the traveler themselves experienced, right? The time traveler, the individual that's taking this time travel journey, their measurement of time, the kind of time that would be recorded on their own wristwatch, which of course is traveling physically with them, that would be their personal time. Now, external time is something else. External time is the time as it would be experienced or measured by what else? So tell me about that. What is the external time? Personal time, good. It is the time that the traveler themselves experienced. But what about the external type of time? That's the question here. Okay, good, Jason. Time as it's experienced by other clocks and other observers. True. So we kind of get to have it both ways. When we ask this question, how much time is in between getting in and getting out of the machine? Here's the right answer. Maybe one of you guys could say to me, it's sort of not a straight answer. You have to give sort of a dual answer. So how much time does separate between when he gets in and when he gets out of the machine? Now that's the question. Since we've defined these two different types of time, now we can actually answer this. So it takes how much time between when he gets in and when he gets out? Sort of a trick question a little bit, but you'll be able to answer it, I'm sure. So how much is it? I'm just asking you for a number, for an amount of time. How much time did it take to enter this cylinder and then between that and then exiting it? How much time was that? Okay, Jason, you say 1 hour for personal, 7 for external. Well, 6, I guess, right? Because we're going with emerging at 6 p.m. relative to the external clocks, but 1 p.m. relative to his own clock. So yeah, it's 1 hour of personal time and it's 6 hours of external time. Is that a possible thing? Is that a paradox? Is that contradictory? Well, no, not actually, because again, following the theory of space-time given by Einstein, still confused, but why are we saying 7 though? And also, Eva, do you understand Jason's response here that you can't just say one figure because this person's a time traveler. So the amount of time they experience is not the same amount of time that like the external world experiences or that passes for all others. So it's not simply that it's 6 hours. It is 6 hours to the external observers, but to the person in the machine, it shows 1 p.m. on their clock, and they were in there for 60 minutes of personal time. So the idea then is that, yes, the amount of time that you experience personally can be different than the amount of time that everybody else experiences aside from you. If you were able to, let's say, move through space at such velocities faster than all other stationary observers, then you would be cycling through time at a slower rate than everyone else, and therefore, relative to them, it would be like you're going into the future. An hour of time spent personally moving at that rate would equal fill in the blank, a much longer amount of time for everybody else who's not exposed to those type of forces. So there's no paradox actually at all between saying that I could experience, let's say, an hour of time while the rest of the world experiences a year, 10 years, 100 years, because time is not a fixed quantity, and it would vary according to the theory of relativity if we had these differing states of velocity, or if we could control forces that would allow us to approach those speeds. So yeah, no real paradox then. And let me read to you then the discussion that's made by the author in the book. Let's kind of back that up with the textbook discussion. So Lewis says this. What is time travel? And this is on page 466. Okay, yeah, Eva, so a question from you before I get to this. Yeah, so the individual in the machine has experienced 1 hour. Yes, so it took an hour to them. But it's a time machine. I mean, you got to consider this is time travel we're talking about. So since it's time travel, it's not like everybody else outside also went through 1 hour. Because if that is the case, then there's no discrepancy between the two time frames. And that means that the person just stood in a box for an hour while everyone looked at it. That's not a time machine. A time machine is you get into it, and when you get out, it's like it's the future. All of it's the future, and you have not, aged the same amount of time as everybody else because you've spent, let's say, like 15 minutes just taking the journey relative to yourself. But now you're in a future world that's like a year, 2 years, 3 years ahead of when you entered the machine. So time travel. I mean, we've all seen movies like this, right? It's not like you just age like we all age and everybody ages at the same rate. That's not what we call time travel. Time travel is you're zooming ahead in time. So what that means is more time passes for other observers than it does for you. And that's personal and external time. So the author here, Lewis, what is time travel? It involves a discrepancy between time and time. The traveler departs and then arrives at his destination. The time elapsed from departure to arrival is the duration of the journey. But if he is a time traveler, the separation in time between departure and arrival does not equal the duration of the journey. He departs, he travels for an hour. Let us say then he arrives. The time he reaches is not the time 1 hour after the departure. It is later if he has traveled toward the future. Earlier if he has traveled toward the past. If he has traveled far toward the past, it is earlier even than the departure. And how can it be that the same two events, departure and arrival, are separated by two unequal amounts of time? So as it follows on to the next page, page 467, I asked how it could be that the same two events were separated by two unequal amounts of time, and I set aside the reply that time might have two independent dimensions. Instead, I reply by distinguishing time itself, external time from personal time of a particular time traveler, roughly that which is measured by his wristwatch. His journey takes an hour of personal time, let's say. The wristwatch reads an hour later at arrival than at departure. But the arrival is more than an hour after the departure in external time, if he travels towards the future. So we thus have one paradox explained away, and the way of reconciling this apparent paradox with common sense is to introduce the notion of personal and external time. And that's not just an arbitrary stipulation, like let's just make up two different definitions to get around the problem. We all actually do have our own personal time. The reason that it coincides with the external time for us is because we're not able to achieve speeds or expose ourselves to physical forces that cause the time dilation effect to be anything larger than an infinitesimal amount. Okay, so there's one paradox and his explanation of how it's not so logically impossible. To the next paradox that's mentioned in the article, he discusses a kind of a funny or interesting scenario that could play out in like a time travel situation. So let's talk about that. The second one is, well, what about if you see someone, let's say, go to the past and have a conversation with a previous stage of themselves, okay? So here's a question. Well, let me be a little more detailed. The time traveler goes to the past. Okay, so here's another paradox that is mentioned. Imagine in a time travel scenario, and this is something that is explored in a lot of these science fictional films that deal with this type of theme. A person will go to the past and they'll have an actual interaction with their past self. So like imagine you right now go back to like 2015 to tell your younger self about the upcoming election of Donald Trump or something. I don't know, just you want to tell them about the future, or you tell them that there's going to be a coronavirus and just understand that that's what happens in 2020. I don't know. So, you go to the past and you talk to your previous self. Let's suppose it's a phone call. I don't know why it doesn't have to be a phone call. It could be, face-to-face interaction, but let's go with the phone call. So you make this call. You go back to 2015 and you call yourself in the past. And now it's you, the future part from 2020, who's come back talking to your younger self. So that's the question. Is this two people on the phone or is it one? The reason this seems to some people to be a paradox is because both of those answers seem at least somewhat credible or reasonable. But I would just ask you, if you have an intuition about this, what do you think? Is the correct answer, how many of the people are talking on the phone there? If you go to the past and talk to yourself back then. What do you think? You've got a couple of options. Whatever you think, just let me know what, why. Cameron, you say you feel like it would be two because you're not the exact same person from the past. Okay, and so Jason, you're also saying two. It's a little weird though to say two though, because, well, we'll get there. Let's see. No intuitions that it's the same person? You think it's two different people, huh? And Cameron, I like how you gave a reason. You say because you're not the exact same person from the past. But the thing is, okay, the answer is one. It's not two. It's one person. It's not two different people. That's you. You're the same person. But why do you think that the argument is that it is one? Or let me say it differently. If these are not two different people, right? These are not two different people. It's the same person. Then what are the two things? It's the same person, but it's two what of the same person? The reality argument that we learned from earlier. Which one is this, Jason? And what is your comment in reference to what is because of the reality argument we learned from earlier? Good, Christopher. Thank you for that comment, and I'll get right to that. That's the right response. But Jason, maybe if you want to restate it one more time, maybe, and then I can think about your question or comment. The reality argument. Oh, that everything's real, like all the future, past, and present. They're all real moments. Yes. So there is this stage of you from the past which remains permanently a part of the universe. Jason, you say how things in the past are just as real, so therefore it is the same person. But now that I think about it, it doesn't make sense. It's definitely something that actually does make some good sense. I'm glad that you said that. Because if you think about it right, these are two temporal parts of the same individual. All right, so like one of the temporal parts is later along in the timeline of their existence, and they're talking with the previous temporal part. Let me show you a graph that is used in the book to explain this possibility. Okay, so here's a space-time diagram. Y-axis, x-axis, and then the temporal dimension running through. So let's say that, let me actually redraw the line a little bit to give myself a little more space to look right. Okay, now, suppose that this is you, born in 2002, and you're living. All of a sudden, it's 2021, next year, and the Apple time machine, the iTime machine comes out or whatever, okay? Next year, it drops, a lot of people get it, and you get one. So At that point, you decide, you know what I want to do? I want to go back and just talk to myself from 2015. I want to tell my younger self something. So you do that. You go back, and then because you're going back in the temporal dimension, the line doesn't just continue off to the right like it would with a normal human like us that does not travel in time, because we only keep moving forward toward the future. If you had this ability to go back in time, the streak would loop back. Okay? Now, since you've gone back to the year 2015, and then let's say you had that conversation and you're like, okay, I'm done. I'm going back over to my relative present again to 2021. If we cut a line through this section of your timeline, of your temporal space-time diagram, do you see how there's two cross sections on this cut? Okay, so there's this section. That's one of the temporal parts. The temporal part located in 2015. Then there's this later temporal part of the same sequence, which is engaged with a conversation with the earlier temporal part. That's why there are two. There are more reasons also to say that these are two temporal parts of the same person. Why would you say that when you're talking to yourself on that telephone in the past, that this is not two different people? Well, if it's two different people, when you're talking to like your friend, somebody who's not you, you don't have memories of being that person. But these two stages of the individual are connected by psychological continuity. What I mean, in other words, is that this 2021 time traveler that's gone back to talk to themselves in the past remembers receiving the phone call at the earlier time point from their future self. It doesn't have to loop back, Eva. I'm just saying that it does if a person goes into the past. Do you understand that we're talking about a person who goes and travels to the past? If you go to the past, the graph is just showing that that's what it depicts on the graph. I'm like saying, suppose, for the sake of argument, that someone travels back in time to the past. This graph is just a graph of that. I mean, so why is it looping back? Because this is backwards time. Look at this axis. It's time. It's marked off at initially 2002. This streak represents the person moving forward in time as time passes. At 2021, we are just assuming a scenario. It's a hypothetical scenario. We're assuming that the person in 2021 goes back to 2015. So why does it loop back? Because that represents in the diagram the person who was in 2021 traveling back in time along that dimension of t. Does this make sense, Eva? I don't want you to be confused. Do you understand? So it's time travel we're talking about. We're talking about a person who goes back in time. This movement is just, I was in 2021, I got in a time machine, and it sent me back to 2015. That's all that means. But I'm trying to now explain something new. That the reason that this is two different temporal parts of the same streak, the same timeline, is because there's a psychological continuity between the different stages. Like you can remember yourself starting this class, okay? Like you remember, I would hope, enrolling in the class, attending some of the earlier meetings. And so if you had a time machine and you went back to the beginning of the semester now, and you like talked to that part of your past, yourself in the past, you would remember having been that person. You would remember having been at that point in the timeline, having received such a phone call. So like this point in the sequence of time remembers all the earlier points. Like you remember being 10 years old. You remember being in 2015 and before and in the time period afterwards. If you're talking to other people that are not identical to you, you don't have memories of what they experienced. Okay, so like these two stages should not be thought of as two different people. Now, why does a person seem to think that? And why is that initial response that some of you gave? Well, I can understand why, because it looks to all outward appearances when there's one person on one side of the phone call, and then there's like this younger looking individual on the other side of the phone call. To all appearances, this seems to be two distinct human bodies. But these are two temporal parts of the same object. And the reason, once again, that that's clear is because there's a psychological linkage between the present point and the past points in the timeline. So let me read about that, and you can hear him talk about it. Okay. Yeah, so here we go. A time traveler who talks to himself on the telephone, perhaps, looks for all the world like two different people talking to each other. It is not quite right to say that the whole of him is in two places at once. Because remember, okay, like as we were studying the whole space-time theory and the concept of temporal parts, according to that idea, you're not fully present at any moment of time. Like at most, at a single moment, there's one of your temporal parts located in space at that time. So there are more than one temporal part of you throughout your existence. There's a new one for each new moment. And so the two things are two different temporal parts of the same object or the same person. And that shouldn't be too strange to think that it looks like two whole human beings, but it's the same person, just two parts of them. Because as you should remember, you are not fully present even right now, according to the space-time theory. So just seeing a whole human body, if you understand this theory, you're not seeing a whole person. You're seeing a part. You're seeing a part in time. And the whole person is the streak that extends through all the moments that they do exist in time. Okay, so it says here, it is not right to say that the whole person is in two places at once, since neither of the two stages involved in the conversation is the whole thing, or even the whole of the part of him that is located at the time of the conversation. What's true is that he, unlike the rest of us, has two different complete stages located at the same time at different places. So yeah, like for all of us, how many of our temporal parts are in the world at a given time? Well, it's just one, because you can't loop back into the past given current day technology that exists. So like right now, there's one of your temporal parts in space. Unless, of course, I guess if the time travel gets developed in the future, then maybe there is another one of your future temporal parts around somewhere that they're just hiding from you and not letting you know that they did that. But look, if you're not doing time travel, then you have one temporal part in the world at a given time. But if you're able to loop back, by means of the graph and the diagram you see here, there would be two cross sections of the same space-time worm located in the year 2015. Now, think about this. Suppose you get back into, after you made the phone call, and then you just zoom back ahead to 2021. You're like, wait a minute, I forgot something. There's something that I left back there in 2015. Let me go back again. Now you're going to make a second trip back. And if you do that, and then you go back to 2021 again, how many of your temporal parts would be located in 2015 at that time? If you made a second subsequent trip back, now there would be how many temporal parts of you in 2015? New number I'm asking about. And you can just see it on the graph, hopefully. Eva, what do you know? Now it's how many? Or anybody, but I was just pointing out on you because you said here, why did it loop back? So now you can demonstrate your full mastery of the concept and you tell me the answer. How many of the temporal parts are there now? It's due to the second trip back. And I'm talking about how many temporal parts are there in 2015 after the second trip is done. How many temporal parts are there in 2015 now? Yes, it's 3. Why is there 3? Well, there's the original version of you in 2015, just hanging out back there, and I don't know, you're like 13 years old. Then there's the whatever age you are in 2021 version that came back and made the first trip. And now there's the even later version of you that made the second subsequent trip back. And this like third one, I don't know, it could be like hiding in a bush, watching the other two have their phone call, and then you would have 3. And so for each subsequent trip back to the same point in time, you would add another of your temporal parts to that part of space-time. This great movie, Time Crimes, that I was talking about, really uses that concept because the guy makes several trips back, and he just kind of keeps making the situation worse because every time he does, that adds another one of these temporal parts, and he ends up getting into all these problems that he kind of can't undo. But yeah, a little bit more on the psychological continuity element of this. David Lewis says, what reason should I have to regard him as one person and not two? What unites the stages into a single person? The problem of personal identity is acute if he is the sort of time traveler whose journeys are instantaneous. I answer that what unites the stages of a time traveler is the same sort of mental continuity that unites anyone else. The only difference is that whereas a common person is connected and continuous with respect to external time, the time traveler is connected and continuous only with respect to his own personal time. Taking the stages in order, change is mostly gradual rather than sudden, and at no point is there sudden change in too many different respects at once. So like the course of this person's existence who keeps traveling around in time is that they are born here and their temporal parts move in a sequence of stages through time and space in this direction. But each new point in this streak has memory of all preceding points. And so the psychological continuity gives us a reason to think they're the same. For example, when you see yourself in like an old photo or video from the past, why is it that that's you and that's not a different person? Well, it's the same reason given here, because that person in the photo is someone you have a memory of being. You remember the experiences and you have a psychological continuous experience from having been at that point to the current point in time. If you look at a picture of some other random person who is not you, there's no psychological linkage between you and the person shown in the photograph. Like you don't have memories of being them, you don't have experiences that were the ones that that person had in the past, which you can remember. So the same reason that younger stages of you in our own timeline are the same person are the reasons that younger stages of the time traveler are the same person in this diagram. And we should not be thrown off by the fact that, of course, if you go to the past, there's going to be you in the past and then the person who made the travel back, both present in space. Obviously, when you go back in the past, it's not that your previous self doesn't exist in the past, because you've already have existed at that time. So you would travel to that time and you would see the events that happened then, including the events involving yourself. But you'd be looping back on yourself, and then two temporal parts would be existing in the same moment and in the same space. Okay, so another little paradox is explained away. The appearance of it being ambiguous, whether it's two or one people. Essentially, just to kind of cap this off, Lewis says the right answer is that it's one person, but it's two different temporal parts. And so whatever appeared to be a paradox is really not. It's not that there's both one and two people. It's one person, but two temporal parts, and that's fully consistent according to the theory. Okay, well, for the next little paradox, we're going to talk about the concept of closed loops of causation. These weird closed causal loops are very, very kind of strange, and they do seem somewhat paradoxical. So, another apparent paradox is the concept of a causal loop, a loop of causation. Let me explain to you like one example the author gives where such a loop would happen. Okay, so go back to the scenario I just mentioned where you take a trip back to the past. Well, how about this? I'm going to change up the scenario a little bit, okay? So follow me now. Tomorrow you get a phone call, okay? Tomorrow you get a phone call, and you get a phone call from somebody whose voice is odd, because to you it sounds a lot like your voice, maybe just a little older, but you're like, wow, that sounds just like almost like me. Anyway, the person who's calling you on the phone says this: look, I have a very simple thing I need you to do, and it's very important. I'm giving you some instructions right now, and I just need you to follow the instructions to build a machine. And here's how you do it. So you're like, wow, this is a weird phone call, but the person's telling you it's very, very important, and you just have to listen. So you listen to them, and they give you a blueprint and some detailed instructions on how to build some type of machine, okay? And you follow those instructions, and you build this machine. Now, you leave the machine sitting in your garage or something for years, but after like 5 or 10 years passes, you blow the dust off of it, and you get in the garage with it, and you think about how it seems to be a time travel device, okay? So what you received on the phone call were the instructions on how to build a time machine from some mysterious person, okay? So now you've had this machine with you that you built based on the instructions for years, and you never have used it. But now you're saying, you know what, I want to use it, I want to turn it on. So you turn it on, and you get into it. Now let's say this is 2030. At that time in the future, with this machine that's been collecting dust in your garage, you get in there. and you take a trip back to 2020. Now, what do you think I'm going to say is the next little point in this narrative? So you received a phone call, who knows who that is, but they told you how to build a machine, and you did. You left it in the garage for 10 years dormant. Now it's 2030, you kick it on, and you use it to travel back to 2020. And now you're going to 2020 from 2030 with the intention and the goal to do what back in 2020? Loops of causation, everybody. Come on. You watch enough movies. I'm sure that when you watch movies, you're like, I know where this is going. So tell me, what do you think is the point of this person taking that backwards trip? Okay, good, Jason, to call your past self. But why? So that you can do what? Just have a nice chat? What's the point of the phone call? You or anybody can tell me. Why is the phone call being placed? I think you seem to understand why, because you gave a very clear comment, which is on point. To teach yourself how to make the machine. Yes, exactly. So you return to 2020, and you are now back in 2020, and you're like, okay, my younger Chapman college days, I'm going to make this phone call because when I was at that age, I received that phone call. So I need to make sure the phone call happens when I'm at that age. So now you are the future stage of yourself, talking to your past self and giving them the knowledge about how to build a time machine. Now, let's take a look at this situation here. How did you learn how to build a machine in this situation? Well, because you heard the instructions given to you on the phone. Okay, that's fair. How did you give the instructions to your younger self? Well, because you remember having received them on the phone call that you got when you were the younger self. But it's really weird because where did the blueprint for the machine come from in the first place? It seems like it's just caught up in the causal loop. It's like a circularity here. You make the call because you received the call. But you only receive the call because you're the one who places it to yourself, having already remembered receiving it earlier. And so it leaves us with no real kind of satisfying answer. Where did the information come from to begin with about how to build the machine? Could this be a paradox? Could the possibility of these closed causal loops create impossible situations that therefore show time travel is impossible? Well, in this paradox of time travel, David Lewis's reaction to it, I don't know if it's the most solid of all possible reactions. I think he does a better job dismissing the apparent paradox of a different amount of time between the same two events, or the other one about how, if you place a call to yourself in the past, that's not just two people, but really one, two temporal parts. But in this case, his response is just sort of to say the following. Yeah, it's weird, but there's other weird stuff that we already know is true about the universe. And so it's no more or less weird than other things that we already accept. Like, for example, where did the universe come from? Can you answer that one for me? Any answer that you give is going to kind of be mind-boggling. If you say, oh, it's always been there. Well, from our studies in the cosmological argument, that seems to be like a head-scratching response. How could it always be there? Everything has a beginning. On the other hand, if you say something caused it and it just came out of nothing, that also doesn't really kind of make too much good sense. But we know that the universe does exist, and it either always has been here or it has been caused by something else. So if that kind of thing is a fact about reality, then these closed loops of causation, he believes, are no more or less strange than that. Let me talk to you about it here, what it says in the book. Yeah, so here it is on page 469. He says, recall the time traveler who talked to himself. He talked to himself about time travel, and in the course of the conversation, the older self told the younger self how to build a time machine. That information was available in no other way. The older self knew because the younger self had been told, and then the information had been preserved by memory. His younger self knew after the conversation because the older self had known the information and told them. But where did the information come from in the first place? Why did the whole event happen? There's simply no answer. The parts of the loop have an explanation, like why do I know how to make the machine? Oh, I got a phone call. Why am I placing this phone call? Oh, to tell someone how to make a machine. If you just look at one little link in the causal story, one link makes sense, but when you back out and look at the whole scenario, it kind of is incomprehensible. He says there's simply no answer. is that's strange, but not impossible and not too different from other inexplicable things that we already accept. Everyone agrees that God or the Big Bang or the entire infinite past of the universe is inexplicable and perhaps uncaused. So if those are possible, why not also the inexplicable causal loops that could arise in time travel? Okay, so I mean, that his response there is, yeah, it is a little weird, but to be honest, it's not any weirder than the idea that there's a universe that's always existed or that came out of nothing, or even if it was created by God, that there's no explanation at all for why God exists, or what the backstory is as to how that is possible. So if we already know or accept that there are some things that are very strange, then the closed loops of causation that time travel makes possible are sort of in the same category. Okay, now there's just one last paradox that he wants to dismiss at the end, and this is kind of the most famous part of the whole essay, so save it for last, and it is, I guess, also chronologically last in this paper. But he talks about this kind of funny science fictional scenario where there's a person who wants to try and change the past. Okay, so as you've seen a lot of films, they explore that theme of a time travel story, like someone wants to go back and change things that happened originally. So we're imagining this situation. There's a guy named Tim. I don't know if it's a play on words because Tim is sort of like time, but time, Tim. Okay, so it's Timothy. He wants to go back in time to the year 1920, back when his grandfather was in his prime. Now here's what's up with his grandfather. His grandfather was this wealthy industrialist, made a lot of money, and he gave it to Tim as an inheritance. So Tim is basically rich off of his grandfather's wealth, but for whatever reason, Tim has developed a deep-seated hatred of his own grandfather, and he despises his grandfather and everything about him. But his grandfather's dead. He passed away years back. Not in 1920, but at a ripe old age later on. Nonetheless, Tim just despises this man and everything he stands for. So what he wants to do is kill his grandfather. But it seems like it's a little too late, obviously, because he's already dead. So Tim, he's not going to let it go, though. Here's what he did. He took all the money inherited from the grandfather, and he used it to build a time machine. Okay? And he's going to now get in this machine, and he's going all the way back to 1920, full of anger and rage and a plan to assassinate his grandfather back in 1920. But there's some problematic aspects of this scenario, because if he succeeds in killing the grandfather back in 1920, then that would prevent the birth of his own father, who is the grandfather's son, because he fathers that child later than 1920 in history. So if he was to assassinate the grandfather previously, before he was able to give rise to the father of Tim, then Tim himself would never have been born in the first place, therefore making the trip to the past impossible. So here's the question. What do you think? Can Tim kill his grandfather or not? Can he do it or can he not do it? And Lewis says this to some people seems like it's a paradox, because there's a reason to think that both answers are somewhat viable or plausible. So let's go over that and let's just see what you could think about on that scenario. Would you say that he can or cannot achieve the goal of killing his grandfather in 1920, according to the description of the scenario I gave you, where we already know that Tim was born later on? Okay, Megan, you say that he cannot. And that's, I think, a reasonable response, because, like we've said, if he was to somehow succeed, that would contradict the timeline of events. Now, Jason, you're saying yes because you still have a temporal part, but the thing is that temporal part's already got its position in the timeline, and it's already definitively something that didn't discontinue in 1920. So what Lewis says is that, in fact, the answer is no, he can't succeed, because it would involve a contradiction in the timeline of events. It would mean that Tim both was born, so he was capable of traveling to the past, but also he was prevented from having been born by this successful assassination of his grandfather. So it looks as though he really can't possibly achieve this goal. And Megan, you say, I think his temporal part would get stuck in 1920 if he killed his grandfather, because then the rest of his grandfather's timeline would not exist. Well, yes, but I mean, more importantly, the event of his grandfather's death would make him never have existed in the first place. but he does exist in the first place. He's clearly a person who's from the future that has traveled to the past. So we can't like annul or cancel the fact that he was born. That's just a fact of the universe, and so we can't contradict the existing facts. For example, look at yourself. Do you exist? We've gone over that and studied Descartes, but even if you didn't, I think it's clear to all that yes, you exist. So is there any way that we can just delete from this program your birth? Like, never mind, the person never was born. I'm not talking about killing you now, but editing reality so that you were not born in the first place is not possible. It's already happened, and it can't be changed. So what a time traveler would actually be able to do is not change the past, but just sort of observe the events as they played out originally. And that means that if our man Tim goes back and he tries to kill his grandfather, he's actually going to fail inevitably. No matter how hard he tries, something will prevent him from succeeding. Now, what will prevent him from succeeding? Don't think that it's going to be something like magical, like he fires the bullet and the gun just turns to dust or something, but rather it'll be a more ordinary reason, like the gun will jam, or at the last moment he'll get a feeling of mercy and he'll just be unable to do it, or at that exact moment, like Mr. Magoo or something, the grandfather reaches down to pick up the newspaper and the bullet just flies over his head and that was his only attempt and he missed. Or it's a case of mistaken identity. That looks just like his grandfather, but he, assassinated a random different citizen in the year 1920 and his grandfather's alive and well. But whatever does happen, we know that the grandfather will escape this assassination attempt because he lives on and he gives birth. Well, he doesn't give birth, but he sires the child that becomes the parent of Tim himself. And so let me read about it here in the words of Lewis. So he says, he tries to provide motivation for the yes answer and the no answer. So he kind of speaks to both cases. In favor of the idea that, that he can do it, he says this. He has what it takes. Conditions are perfect in every way. The best rifle money could buy. The grandfather's an easy target. He's only 20 yards away. There's no breeze. He's got his door locked so no intruders can get to Tim. Tim is a great shot, and he's at the peak of training. What could stop him? The forces of logic can't stop him. There's no powerful chaperone standing by to defend the past from interference. So it seems like Tim should be able to kill the grandfather just as much as anybody else ever could. Now, after that, the next paragraph, he goes into the opposite intuition. Tim cannot kill grandfather. Grandfather lived. So to kill him would be to change the past. But the events of the past are not subdivisible into temporal parts, and therefore they cannot change. Either the event of 1920 always included Tim killing the grandfather, or else they always didn't. You may be tempted to speak of the original 1920 and the new 1920, but this would be to give two names to the same year. If we do speak so, we confer two names on one thing. The events of 1921 only have one set of facts, not 1921 version A and then version B. So as he goes down a little further, he says, you know, of course, how the story must end if it is to remain consistent. He will somehow fail. Since Tim did not kill grandfather in the original 1920, he will not be able to kill him in this 1920 either. Why not? Well, for some common reason. Perhaps some noise will distract him at the last moment. Perhaps he will miss despite all his target practice. Perhaps his nerve will fail. His failure by no means proves that he was not really able to. We often try and fail to do what we're able to do. So there you go. He won't actually be able to succeed, but it doesn't necessarily mean that anything kind of bizarre or supernatural will happen. He'll just experience the failure of the attempt as it was already destined to happen in the year of 1920, which timelessly includes this time travel back. Now there's one last little kind of, I think, very insightful and deep insight that the author mentions here at the end. And I kind of want to talk about that because that makes this a little more relatable and relevant to like your actual life. The time travel unit of the class is one that I think is quite interesting and fun, but I understand sometimes when students learn about it, they can get a heavy sense of it being hyper unrealistic or detached completely from anything that is a little bit more relevant to your everyday concerns or whatever. You know, philosophy is kind of like that, but when we talk about time travel, I think some feel like, oh, that's getting off the rails. It's just so weird and like science fiction stuff. But there's a more important point about this as it relates to all of us. Because in the same way as Tim is not able to change the past, if the space-time theory is true, you're not able to change the present or the future because all the moments of time and space exist. So any event that ends up happening is as it was always going to be and as it always existed in space-time. So like you may think right now that you're watching this lecture, but you could have just skipped it, you know, that it was possible for you to have made a different decision not to attend the lecture. But if the space-time theory is correct, that's not so. It's part of your destiny that you're watching this right now because all the temporal parts of you exist and they always have. So the point of your timeline that occupies a seat watching this lecture in 2020 at 9:50 a.m. is unalterable, it's immutable. So it starts to make it seem as if we're like Tim in a way, except it's not that we can't undo the past. We're just powerless to change or act counterfactually in a way that's contrary to the actual outcome. When you think about your free will, you think, I'm able to do things other than what I actually do. Though I'm watching the lecture, I had the freedom to choose to do otherwise. But this starts to make it seem as if the possibilities of counterfactual behavior or events are mere mental illusions. The only events that ever play out are the actual events. And the possible events are just thoughts that you have. Try and prove otherwise. Take this marker. Am I free? Am I going to drop it or am I going to hold it? I'm going to hold it. No, I'm going to drop it. I am going to drop it. Was that free will? Was that me doing something that wasn't supposed to happen? Well, we don't have a counterfactual version of reality in which I did something else. We just have the one actual case. So, in a weird, interesting way, if you take this away from the time travel discussion, the metaphysical implications of Einstein's theory of space-time are very broad and deep for all of us, regardless of whether we develop time travel. Because it would mean that you're locked in to a set of events and you're basically the observer of the events with the illusion of being able to control the outcomes. But I want to say a little bit more about that to just kind of elaborate on it at the beginning on Monday. But other than that, we will start on a new topic on Monday. So I want you guys to be sure to follow the syllabus, read the upcoming articles. It's a key part of the semester because the essays that I'm going to assign you next week deal with some of the topics that we're working on now. So keep reading the book. Don't just attend lecture and not read the book. Please read the book also for your own fun and also just for your own knowledge. But okay, guys, thanks again. Have a good weekend. And I'm sure we'll be back here on Monday. So take care until then. All right? Thank you. Bye-bye.